So this all happened last New Year's Eve, and I swear, I can still feel the fear in my bones. I'm writing this because I just need to get it off my chest, and, I don't know, maybe it'll help someone avoid making the same stupid mistake I made that night. It had been a long day at work, one of those days that feels like it'll never end, especially when it's just you and a couple other coworkers closing up shop on New Year's Eve. I work at a small office in the city, but I live in the suburbs, so by the time I got out, it was already dark. Really dark. The streets were almost empty except for a few cars here and there, and most people had already started celebrating or heading home for the night. Now, I've lived in the area for a few years, and I'm used to walking home. It's about a 30-minute walk, and usually, I'd take the longer, well-lit path by the main road. But that night, I was exhausted. I just wanted to get home faster, crash on the couch, and watch the ball drop from the comfort of my apartment. So, instead of walking the usual way, I decided to cut through the woods behind my neighborhood. It was a wooded path I had walked down a million times before, nothing fancy, but it was a shortcut. Honestly, I didn't even think twice about it. Yeah, it was a little creepy with the trees stretching over the path, casting weird shadows, but I had done it so many times that I didn't feel afraid. I had my phone in my hand, earbuds in, listening to some random playlist to distract myself from the chill in the air. The whole world felt so quiet as I walked into the woods, like the kind of silence that feels too still, you know? Just the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. It was that eerie, almost hollow feeling, like something was wrong, but you can't quite place your finger on it. But I kept walking, trying to shake off the discomfort, and that's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just some kid messing around, maybe someone running through the woods, laughing or shouting, maybe even a group of people partying in the distance. But the sound came closer. Rapid footfalls, heavy and quick, like someone running full force right behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled my earbuds out. I turned around, expecting to see some teenager or a lost dog or maybe even a jogger, but there was nothing. Just the dense trees, the kind that make it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I felt stupid for thinking it was something innocent. I'm not some paranoid freak, but after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, a little faster now, but I could still hear the footsteps behind me. They weren't getting closer, but they weren't fading either. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but something about the way the sounds echoed made my stomach twist. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the scream. It wasn't loud at first, more like a sudden burst of breath, followed by a strained yell. Help! Help me! It sent a wave of panic through me. It was coming from deeper in the woods, but it sounded like someone who was in real distress. For a second, I almost ran toward it, thinking I should help, but the fear that hit me in the gut was overwhelming. My mind was spinning. Something didn't feel right. I kept walking, but my legs felt heavier with every step. The scream had stopped, replaced by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the brush, like someone was running right toward me. Fast. My heart was pounding in my chest now, adrenaline pumping as my feet moved faster than before. I was barely breathing when I heard it again, closer this time. Help. It was a man's voice, frantic, desperate. I didn't stop. My feet were almost flying, even though I knew, deep down, that I was heading straight into the woods, where I could get lost in an instant. That's when I saw him. A figure, maybe 30 feet away, standing still in the dark, watching me. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or some guy out for a late-night walk. But as I blinked, I realized what I was seeing. The man was wearing a full Santa Claus costume. That's when my blood ran cold. I don't know what made me stop, but I did. My legs locked in place, like my body knew something my brain hadn't quite caught up with yet. The man in the Santa suit wasn't moving. He just stood there, in the middle of the path, staring at me. The red and white of the costume looked out of place in the dark woods, almost like it didn't belong there, like it was a warped version of something familiar. His face was hidden under a fake white beard, but his eyes, those eyes, stuck with me. They weren't the playful, jolly eyes you'd expect from someone dressed up for Christmas. They were cold. Empty. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to scream, to turn around and run, but I couldn't move. Something in my gut told me this wasn't just some guy out for a stroll. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at him. My phone was still in my hand, but I couldn't even bring myself to look at it. The footsteps behind me had stopped, and for a moment, everything felt unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet where your breath sounds too loud and the rustle of leaves feels like an explosion. Then, without a word, he took a step toward me. That's when everything clicked. I don't know why I didn't run sooner. Maybe I thought I was being paranoid, maybe I just didn't want to believe it. But the second he moved, the reality hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't some harmless guy playing a prank. There was something wrong here. I turned. My instincts took over, and I bolted. The woods were thick, but my heart was racing so fast that the ground seemed to move beneath me. The path felt like it was stretching on forever, the trees bending toward me as if they were closing in. Behind me, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, fast, chasing me. At first, I thought I might have just been imagining it. Maybe I was just freaking out. But no. There was no mistaking the sound, the thud of boots against the dirt, the brush snapping under heavy feet, getting louder with every second. I glanced over my shoulder. He was right there. The man in the Santa suit was running after me, knife in hand. I froze for a second. That's when I saw it. The knife was long, gleaming in the dim light. I could see the handle, dark, worn, like it was something he'd been holding onto for a while. My breath hitched in my chest, and for a split second, I thought I was going to faint. But then, panic kicked in. I wasn't going to die in some stupid woods, not like this. I pushed myself harder. The sound of my boots pounding against the dirt was drowned out by the sound of his steps getting closer, closer. Every time I thought I might be gaining ground, he seemed to close the distance between us even faster. His voice rang out behind me, something that sounded like laughter, but it was sick and twisted. I didn't know the woods. I knew the path, but the trees and the underbrush were unfamiliar and closing in, making it harder to find my bearings. The adrenaline surged in my body, my mind racing. Where could I go? How do I get away? I needed to hide. I needed to get away from him. I turned sharply to my left and darted off the path, toward the thicker part of the woods. The trees here were dense, and the ground was uneven. I could barely see my hands in front of my face, the only light coming from a faint sliver of moonlight between the branches. My heart was pounding in my ears, my breath ragged as I tried to push through the brush. I had no plan. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to be anywhere but here, but I had to keep moving. Keep running. I could hear him getting closer again. His footsteps were too loud, too fast, he wasn't slowing down. The leaves crunched under his feet, and then his voice, deep and menacing, shouted, "You can't get away from me." I didn't stop. Somehow, I found a small dip in the ground, like a shallow ravine surrounded by thick brambles. I dove into it, hoping he wouldn't see me. My body hit the cold earth, and I lay there, holding my breath. My chest was on fire from running, my legs shaking. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. For a moment, everything was still. Then, I heard him. He was standing above me that I could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building in my chest. I held my breath so tightly that my lungs started to ache. I could hear the faint rustling of branches above me as the man, still in that ridiculous Santa suit, moved around the ravine, searching for me. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it, but I didn't dare move. I barely dared to blink. Then, the sound of his boots, slow and deliberate, reached my ears. He was circling the area. My mind was racing. I was lying flat on the cold ground, tucked beneath a layer of fallen leaves, praying to God that he wouldn't spot me. There were moments in my life where I could have sworn time had stopped, but this felt like an eternity. Every breath was a risk. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of him speaking. "I know you're here," he said. His voice was low and almost playful. It was unsettling, like he was enjoying this. "You can't hide forever." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, make a noise, do anything to break the tension. But if I moved, if I made a sound, I knew he'd hear me, and that would be it. I'd be dead. I don't know how long I stayed there. My body had gone completely numb from the cold, my back aching against the hard, uneven ground. I could feel my muscles twitching, my legs cramping up, but I couldn't move. Then, there was a shift in the air. A sound, something different. The footsteps. They were no longer right above me. Instead, they were retreating, moving further down the path. I didn't wait to think. I didn't wait to second-guess myself. I scrambled to my feet and bolted. I could hear him start to move again, faster this time, as if realizing I wasn't there anymore. I didn't look back, didn't slow down. I pushed through the underbrush, branches slapping at my face, scraping against my skin, but I didn't care. I was almost certain I could hear him behind me again. The crunching of leaves and twigs was getting louder. It was like he was everywhere at once. His breath was raspy, strained. I tried to push through the woods faster, but the terrain was working against me. The path was narrow and uneven, and I kept tripping, almost losing my balance with every step. Then, I felt it, a hand. I don't know how it happened so fast, but I felt his fingers close around my ankle, pulling me backward. I screamed, trying to yank my leg free, but the grip was too strong. His voice, low and almost soothing, whispered into my ear. "You're not getting away." I kicked, desperate, with every ounce of strength I had left. Finally, I felt his hold loosen, and in that split second, I wrenched my foot free and scrambled forward, desperate to get away. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. I pushed my body to its absolute limit. My legs were burning, my lungs on fire, but the adrenaline kept me going. Somehow, I didn't hear him anymore. For a moment, it was silent. I dared to glance over my shoulder. The path behind me was empty. I couldn't see him, but that didn't mean he wasn't there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. I couldn't stop. I couldn't risk it. So, I kept running. The woods were starting to thin out, and in the distance, I could see the faint outline of the neighborhood. It was still a good distance away, but it gave me a glimmer of hope, something to focus on. I wasn't far now. But then, just as I thought I might be close enough to escape, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, growing louder, closer, unmistakable. He was right behind me. I could feel my body beginning to falter. My breath was ragged, my legs shaking, but I didn't dare slow down. I had to make it to the edge of the woods, to safety. I was so close. But then, I heard his voice again, closer now, and this time, it wasn't playful. It wasn't taunting. It was almost desperate. "You can't outrun me. Not forever." I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I nearly fell. But somehow, I caught myself, pain shooting through my ankle as I pushed through it. My head was spinning from the effort, but I had to get to safety. The trees ahead started to open up into a clearing, just before the edge of the woods. There was a small creek running through it, something I knew well, because it marked the boundary of the woods before the neighborhood. My mind screamed at me to keep going, to push myself even harder, but I could hear him gaining on me again. I had seconds, maybe less. I knew I needed to make a choice. And then, without thinking, I dove into the creek. It wasn't deep, just about knee-high, but the shock of the cold water hit me like a slap to the face. I gasped, my breath catching, but I didn't stop. I forced myself to keep moving, wading through the water, splashing as quietly as I could, praying it would make me harder to follow. The water was freezing, biting at my legs as I struggled against the current, but I kept moving. I couldn't look back. I didn't dare. The creek wound through the woods, and I ducked under low branches, making my way along it, staying low to the ground. Every so often, I'd hear him again, his footsteps not far off, but I stayed hidden in the shadows, hugging the bank. The sound of rushing water drowned out most of the noise, and I held my breath, praying I wouldn't make a sound. I tried not to think of what would happen if he found me in the creek. I tried not to imagine how easy it would be for him to reach me in the open, but somehow, the cold water and the safety of the shadows made me feel a little braver. Minutes passed. It felt like hours, but I didn't dare stop, didn't dare let my guard down. Every so often, I would hear his voice calling out, his steps moving closer, and my stomach would flip. I'd freeze, holding my breath, willing him to pass by. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard him move further away. His steps faded into the distance. I wasn't sure if he'd given up or if he was just circling back, but I didn't wait to find out. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with exhaustion, the water now a distant memory as I climbed out of the creek and sprinted toward the nearest house. I could see the streetlights ahead, the warmth of the neighborhood on the other side. I was almost there. The moment I emerged from the creek, soaked and shivering, I felt like I might collapse right then and there. But I couldn't. I had to keep going. I could still hear the faint echoes of footsteps in the distance, too far to catch me, but the terror wasn't over yet. The neighborhood was close now, but it felt like an eternity as I stumbled forward, my body drenched, my mind foggy with exhaustion. The streetlights ahead seemed like a beacon, but even as they drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The trees behind me whispered in the wind, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I turned the corner onto the main street, heart pounding in my chest. There was a row of houses, some with their lights still on, some dark, the quiet of the suburban street contrasting sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded in the woods. I didn't know what to do. Should I run for the nearest house and knock on the door? Should I just keep going? But then I heard it again. His voice. Don't think you're safe. It sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. I spun around, half expecting to see him standing right there, but the street was empty. The faint, creeping dread told me he was still close. His voice had come from further down the street, somewhere in the shadows, but there was no way to know how far. I couldn't stand there, not knowing where he was. My legs were shaking, every nerve on edge. I had no choice but to keep moving. I ran. Not towards the houses, but away from them. Towards the busy part of town, towards the lights that meant safety, people. The first few houses felt like a blur, the fear still holding me in its grip as I stumbled through puddles, dodging mailboxes, and trying to ignore the pain in my legs. I turned onto a main road, where the streetlights were brighter and the cars passed by at regular intervals. My mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. I felt lightheaded, dizzy, like I might collapse any second. I glanced behind me again, but there was nothing. The silence of the street was almost suffocating, and I knew I couldn't let myself feel relieved yet. I flagged down a car, my hands shaking as I raised it. The car slowed to a stop, the driver's window rolling down. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Can you help me?" The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, took one look at me, soaking wet, my face pale and trembling, and immediately unlocked the doors. Without a second thought, I jumped into the passenger seat. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. I shook my head, tears starting to well up. I couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come out. I just nodded, clutching my arms around myself as I sank into the seat, the warmth of the car doing little to soothe the chill running through me. He didn't ask any more questions. He just drove, slowly at first, but then faster as we hit the main road. I watched the streetlights blur past, not daring to look behind us, not knowing if he was still out there, waiting. It wasn't until we got to a well-lit intersection that I finally felt a little bit of relief. But it wasn't until I saw the flashing lights of a police car up ahead that I started to believe I might actually be safe. The man dropped me off at the nearest station. I could barely stand as I stumbled out of the car, but the officers were there in an instant, taking me inside, asking me questions I could barely answer. The warmth of the police station finally felt like a barrier between me and whatever had just happened in those woods. That I don't remember much of what happened after I got into the police station. Everything felt like a blur, lights too bright, voices too loud, questions coming at me from every angle. They asked if I was sure about what I'd seen, if I was sure it was the same man following me, if I was positive it was a knife. But every question made my skin crawl all over again, bringing the memories rushing back with even more clarity than I wanted. The shock had worn off just enough for the panic to set in. I kept seeing that man's eyes. His cold, lifeless eyes staring at me from under that stupid Santa beard. I could still hear his voice, twisted and desperate, echoing in my mind, "You can't get away from me." But I couldn't keep telling them about that. I had to focus, had to answer their questions. The police were quick to take action. They started searching the area, looking for any signs of him, any evidence that he'd been in the woods. They asked me if I had any idea who he was, if I'd seen him before. I had no clue. He was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, but his behavior, that I knew all too well. The officers checked the nearby woods, combing through every inch of the area. But they found nothing. No traces, no footprints that led anywhere. It was like he had disappeared. A couple of hours passed before they told me to go home. I had to give my statement, and they took my details down, but I was too shaken to care about anything else. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and terror, like everything that had just happened was too surreal to be true. I kept waiting for someone to tell me it was a joke, that it was all in my head. But no one did. It was real. I walked out of the police station and into the night, still feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The air was colder than it should have been for New Year's Eve. The city lights blurred around me, but they didn't feel warm, they didn't feel safe. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him there, but the streets were empty. Still, the fear was constant, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next few days were a blur of restless sleep, avoiding dark places, and trying to convince myself that it was over. That I was safe. But I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just disappeared into the night. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew, he was still out there. And one day, he might come back. Even now, months later, I can't go anywhere without glancing over my shoulder. Sometimes, when I'm walking alone, I hear footsteps behind me and my heart skips a beat. But when I turn around, it's always empty. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't run. If I hadn't hidden in that creek, if I hadn't found the strength to keep moving. I don't know if I would have made it out alive. But I did. And I'm still here. For now.